Thank you for joining us. Welcome to The World Today. I'm Millicent Walker. First, the headlines. Human Rights Office cites growing evidence of war crimes in Ukraine by both Russia and Ukrainian troops. The Ukraine war could last to end of next year, says Prime Minister Boris Johnson, as British Embassy to reopen in Ukrainian capital Kyiv next month. Plus, time running out, says World Food Programme, as Eastern African populations continue to be affected by drought. A warm welcome, everyone. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has suggested there is a realistic possibility the war in Ukraine could continue to the end of next year. Speaking in India, he also said Britain would reopen its embassy in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, next week. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia's recent gains in the east of the country are only temporary and Moscow's forces will be pushed back across the border. A senior Russian military commander has been quoted as saying that Moscow aims to take full control of southern Ukraine as well as the eastern Donbass region. It's not yet clear whether the comments were officially sanctioned. According to the World Bank, physical damage to Ukraine's buildings and infrastructure from Russia's invasion has reached roughly $60 billion. Here's more on the invasion.
Russia's defense ministry said it struck 58 military targets in Ukraine overnight, including sites where troops, fuel depots, and military equipment were concentrated. The ministry said it had also struck 3 targets using high-precision missiles in Ukraine, including an S-300 air defense system and a large concentration of Ukrainian troops with their equipment. Over in Ukraine's southern Black Sea port city of Odessa, many residents have left their homes and are hesitant to move back amidst fears of landing in the city by Russian forces. Early morning in Odessa, Aliana Stepanova, a local resident, heard shelling and took a video of the Black Sea from the window. She said it was such a terrifying morning that she is still scared of it. A shell landed outside of her apartment, leaving a crater on the road and with fragments hitting the windows. In Chernihiv, Ukrainian State Emergency Services released a video showing experts removing Russian bombs from the area and its outskirts as Russia's attack on Ukraine continues. The location of the video was verified through the layout and design of the houses and stadium, which matched street view and satellite photography. Chernihiv, a city with pre-war population of around 290,000, was heavily bombed after Russia invaded Ukraine. In Mariupol, new images of pro-Russian forces were seen on patrol in the Ukrainian port city yesterday as they looked to assert full control after weeks of fighting. Members of the Chechen Special Forces led by Russia's State Duma member Adam Delymkinov were pictured walking near the destroyed administration building of Azovstal Iron and Steel Works, one of the last major strongholds of Ukrainian soldiers in the besieged city. Russian President Vladimir Putin said on Thursday that his troops had liberated Mariupol, which will make it the biggest city to fall into Russian hands since the start of what Moscow calls a special military operation. In the meantime, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia had rejected a proposal for a truce, but adds he still harbors hopes for peace. Mr. Zelensky, in a video address, also warned residents in the south of Ukraine to be very careful, as Russian forces might attempt to register them to hold and falsify a so-called referendum on the status of the south of the country. Russia held a referendum to annex Crimean Peninsula in 2014 in a vote that the international community widely regards as illegal.
The United Nations Human Rights is reporting that there is growing evidence of Russian war crimes in Ukraine, including signs of indiscriminate shelling and summary executions, while it said Ukraine also appeared to have used weapons with indiscriminate effect. The spokeswoman for the Office of UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ravina Shamdasani, said while Russian armed forces have indiscriminately shelled and bombed populated areas, other actions that may amount to war crimes, UN Human Rights Monitors in Ukraine have documented what appears to be the use of weapons by Russian armed forces east of the country.
Nearly 2 months ago has plunged Ukraine into a human rights and humanitarian crisis that has devastated the lives of civilians throughout the country and beyond. The UN High Commissioner urges all parties to respect international human rights law and international humanitarian law, in particular the rules governing the conduct of hostilities. Over these 8 weeks, international humanitarian law has not merely been ignored, but seemingly tossed aside. Russian armed forces have indiscriminately shelled and bombed populated areas, killing civilians and wrecking hospitals, schools, and other civilian infrastructure, actions that may amount to war crimes. We know that the actual numbers are going to be much higher as the horrors inflicted in these areas of intense fighting, such as Mariupol, come to light. The scale of summary executions of civilians in areas previously occupied by Russian forces are also emerging. The preservation of evidence and the decent treatment of mortal remains must be ensured, as well as the psychological and other relief for victims and their relatives.
German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock continued her tour of the Baltic states today, arriving in the Lithuanian capital, Vilnius. Baerbock met Lithuanian President at the presidential palace, which was decorated in Ukrainian colours, before travelling on to meet her counterpart at the Foreign Ministry. She has had to address criticism by allies and commentators of Germany's apparent foot-dragging on delivering the weaponry Kyiv says it needs to fend off Russian attacks. After consultations with the Lithuanian foreign minister, the German foreign minister says she is in favour of a new NATO strategy on the eastern flank to defend against a Russian attack and wants Germany to make a substantial contribution to this. Both ministers also said it requires an appropriate deployment of NATO forces on the eastern flank. So far, about 1,500 NATO troops have been stationed in Lithuania, including about 1,000 from Bundeswehr. Many analysts in Ukraine urgently say they need heavy weapons to drive back a Russian invasion that has now concentrated east of Donbass region. While Ukraine's light armaments and tactics have had some success in slowing Russia's advance, they say stopping and reversing that incursion will need heavy battlefield weaponry like tanks and howitzers. An expert at a panel discussion hosted by a Russian think tank has accused the United States of taking steps to avoid becoming involved in a direct confrontation with Russia amid the ongoing Ukraine conflict. Andrew Shevchentsov, program director of the Valdai Discussion Club think tank, who specializes in U.S. foreign policy and international conflict, believes that the current conflict between both countries as a result of years of provocation by the US-led NATO. He said it is worth noting that after the start of Russia's special military operation late February, the US and some Western countries have been scaling back their military deployments in Ukraine, although they have continued to supply weapons to the country. Shevchentsov believes the US has been sending clear signals that it is not ready to engage in any direct escalation with Russia. According to him, Russia has no intention of threatening the safety of NATO, nor does it want NATO to challenge its bottom line. And the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that there have been no changes to Russia's timetable for making foreign companies pay for gas in rubles, following Britain's decision to grant Russia's Gazprom bank a license for gas payments until the end of May. According to Mr. Peskov, all the timings for the payments were set out in Putin's presidential decree at the end of March, and settlements should be carried out in line with that order. Earlier this week, Mr. Peskov said there was still time for so-called unfriendly countries to switch to payments for gas in rubles that fall due in May. Russia and Ukraine are major commodities producers, and disruptions have caused global prices to soar, especially for oil and natural gas. Food costs have jumped, with wheat, for which Ukraine and Russia make up 30% of global exports. But what ways can exporters, such as those in the Middle East and Africa, benefit from higher prices? Dr. Ted George, the founder and chief narrative officer of Cleos Advisory UK, he puts all into perspective for us. Dr. George, thank you for joining us on the programme.
Good to be back.
The UN says that more than 70% of Africa's economies are at severe risk from this war, this invasion. Talk to us about those risks.
Well, I think the key risk above all is food security, because Russia and Ukraine, they are major suppliers of wheat, sunflower oil and fertilizer, petroleum products as well. And so we've seen costs shoot up. A lot of supplies of food are not as available as before, and that increases the risk of famine. And of course, there are a lot of the increased costs related to this as well. So palm oil prices, for example, have shot up, even though Russia doesn't export palm oil, because other companies are trying to choose substitutes to the oil that they can't get. We're going to see some of the knock-on effects of the world recession potentially on Africa. There are fears there could be a recession, particularly with the level of inflation that's at. But the truth is there are also a number of African countries, the commodity exporters, which are experiencing a boom in commodity prices. So there is some upside here.
So, and you know, we heard from the IMF, 41 African countries facing the maximum exposure to at least one emergency caused by that invasion. How much has been felt, would you say, with respect to that commodities markets, and which areas now in Africa?
Well, I think you can say that, commodity prices have gone completely crazy. They were already very high. Food prices were at historical highs before the Russian invasion and went through the roof. And they've only come back a bit since. I mean, still it's the case for most commodities. They're about 50% higher than they were a year ago. And if you take something like wheat, it's still around $1,100 a bushel. That's twice the price it was 2 years ago. So the thing is, there are real concerns there over supplies. And there are more and more countries trying to fight over fewer and fewer supplies out there, and this is what is driving up the prices. And so across the board, everyone is suffering, not just those directly importing from Russia or Ukraine.
So in terms of the impact, what do you think are perhaps the close solutions to this? Yes, most would say an end to the war so things can come back to normal, but that would still take some time, yes?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think the thing is, a lot of it is about, can we stabilize the global markets and stabilize the global supply chain? It was just starting to recover from COVID when the Russia-Ukraine crisis kicked off. But I think a big point to bear in mind here is that, African countries actually depend on a lot of these imports from Russia. Russia wants to keep exporting things like oil and fertilizer and wheat to Africa. So there is a desire to keep these flows going, but there's just a real concern whether, because of international sanctions, they're going to be disrupted.
So in terms of comments about Africa's reaction to Russia's invasion, do you think that Africa stands as more economically driven, perhaps, rather than political?
Well, I think it really depends on where you're talking about. In Africa, there are some countries which are much more pro-Russia and others have been quite muted about the whole thing. I think the point to make is that Africa has no reason to pick a fight with Russia. Russia only accounts for around 1% of Africa's exports, but is a major supplier of wheat, sunflower oil, fertilizer, petroleum products. And if you take a country, for example, like Senegal, they're exposed across all of those different commodities from Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. So I think the fact is that Russia definitely wants to keep exporting to Africa. It's not under any specific sanctions in that sense. It just can't export to the USA or the European Union. But the trouble is, you may have the willingness of the Russians to continue exporting and the desire from Africa. But if Russian cargoes can't get international insurance, because insurers are unsure if they can actually get involved with Russian companies, we could see the supplies disrupted. So I think the thing is that
so in terms of policy space now, to counter the effects of the shock, what would you say countries should start doing?
Well, I think the thing is, look, in terms of mitigating risks, one thing is, much more emphasis on local food supply. There are a lot of foods which grow much more naturally and easily in Africa. Why are we depending on imported wheat, which is expensive as well? There needs to be much better things like irrigation, but that's not always an option in drought-resistant areas as well. But I think of things like, much better environmental practices, stopping deforestation and the degradation of soil. That is directly leading to the change in rains, which is leading, for example, example, to drought conditions in Somalia. They haven't had rain there for nearly 3 years now, on the edge of a famine. So some of this is short-term and long-term, but essentially a lot of it comes down to much better environmental practices, because the destruction of habitats is directly feeding climate change, which is leading to destruction of habitats. We're getting into a terrible loop here. It's only human activity that can stop this.
Let's talk about fertilizer and food. I mean, you've mentioned that they have indeed risen sharply, given that, Russia and Ukraine are food baskets thus far. But there's also been a sort of crisis in terms of food in parts of Africa. How do you think that, the situation there is holding up with regards to this invasion?
Well, I think what we're seeing is essentially there's been such an impact here, the fact we haven't seen rains across certain parts of Africa as well, that I think we're going to, a lot of countries have tried to respond with controls over prices. We've seen a lot of efforts to secure supplies of wheat from other countries. But I think one of the big problems that we have here is the big exporting countries like Australia, North America, Argentina, they are starting to put limitations on their exports as well, because they don't want local prices to kick off. So I think it's a very difficult situation in terms of the measures that companies can take, but it does depend where you are in Africa. If you're in Southern Africa now, they just had one of the best maize harvests in history, so they're okay, but it's other areas where there's a lot more concern.
Talk to us about the Middle East and perhaps other parts of the world and how this invasion really affects them.
Well, we've seen, look, one of the upsides, of course, is to do with the increase in oil and gas prices. So you can imagine any of the hydrocarbon exporters there, it's given them a real kind of fiscal boost, but it's also driven up inflation. And a lot of these countries also are dependent on imports of things like food and raw materials from the international market. They've all shot up in price. But it has led to real kind of political concerns. If you take the case of Egypt, bread has always been a political issue there. They've had at least 5 major bread riots or crises in the country's history, most recently in 2017. They've managed to fix the price of official bread, but if you can't get official bread, you go to the private market, it's twice the price. It becomes a real issue. So for many countries, food prices are political, whether you like it or not. Not all of them have that kind of fiscal space to control them.
All right, Dr. Ted George, founder, Chief Narrative Officer, Cleos Advisory UK, thanks so much for joining us on the programme.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And a court in Moscow has fined Google's parent company, Alphabet Inc., for failing to remove contentious videos. The US tech giant has handed 2 fines totaling 11 million rubles for administrative violations. Now, the Tangsky District Court in Moscow said the company had distributed inaccurate data about Russian troop losses and civilian casualties in Ukraine. One of the videos was said to show a phone conversation between Russian soldiers and their relatives back home. The troops were said to be complaining of casualties in their ranks. Well, some foreign social media platforms, including Facebook and Instagram, have been blocked in Russia. YouTube, however, remains available. Google faced action from Russia before. It was fined 7.2 billion rubles, that's about 70 million pounds, in December 2021. And this was for failure to delete content deemed illegal in Russia. Coming up on The World Today. Boris Johnson vows to deepen trade ties with India after talks with his counterpart, Modi. Please stay with us. Welcome back to The World Today. Britain and India have agreed to set up defence and business cooperation, a bilateral free trade deal which could be wrapped up by October. On his first visit to the Indian capital as UK Prime Minister, Boris Johnson discussed with his Indian counterpart, Narendra Modi, ways to boost security ties with India, which buys more than half of its military hardware from Russia. Mr. Johnson said Britain was also creating an India-specific open general export license to slash delivery times for defence items. Only the European Union and the United States currently have such licenses. British trade with India, the world's second most populous country with nearly 1.4 billion people, was worth £23 billion in 2019, much lower than the UK's trade with some much smaller economies such as Ireland.
Pleasure it is to be here in in Delhi this morning with my friend Prime Minister Modi, and thank you for the fantastic welcome that you've given us, Narendra. This is, I think, a very auspicious moment in a relationship and a friendship between two democracies, the world's largest democracy in India, the UK, one of the world's oldest democracies, and I don't think that things have ever been as strong or as good between us as they are now. Thank you for the wonderful reception that you've given us. It was amazing. I want to say particularly to the people of Gujarat. We had, they put on a most fantastic welcome for us yesterday, Narendra. It was absolutely extraordinary. I've never seen such a joyful reception. I wouldn't get that necessarily everywhere in the world, but it was absolutely fantastic to come and see your own home state for the first time.
Some would say especially back home. Well, the World Food Programme's Regional Director for East Africa, Michael Donford, has said that there is a real risk of famine in the Horn of Africa. He said that funding gap is forcing the programme to make very tough choices. He was speaking to reporters from Nairobi via video link, saying that the drought already had 3 failed rainy seasons and now approaching the 4th.
The message that I really want to send this evening is that time is running out. Funding is required. We have the capacity to respond only if we have the levels of funding required. And it's forcing us to make very tough choices already. We're effectively taking from the hungry to feed the starving. And at this time, we cannot forget about Eastern Africa and the populations affected by this drought. The drought has already had 3 failed rainy seasons, and we are approaching the 4th. In fact, we are now halfway through it. Originally, the estimates of the number of people affected at the beginning of this year was between 13 and 14 million. We now estimate this has increased to 15 to 16 million. And if the rains fail, or if they are below average, then this number could increase to 20 million. So we have a very real risk of famine. This is happening at a time when the level of food insecurity across the region has increased dramatically.
For more on the situation, Yvonne Dege, regional spokesperson for East and Horn of Africa at the UN's Migration Agency, the International Organization for Migration, joins us now. Welcome to the programme, Yvonne.
Thank you, Millicent.
Paint a picture of how real this risk of famine approaching the Horn of Africa is in the coming months due to the severe drought.
Well, Millicent, the situation facing millions of people in the Horn of Africa is extreme, to say the least. They lack access to water. They lack access to food. This is creating food insecurity. We're seeing heightened levels of malnutrition and hunger. And as a consequence of that, thousands, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people are being displaced as they search for pasture, if they're farmers, and for many, trying to leave the region to find places where they can get refuge and get humanitarian assistance. The lack of the rainfall is also leading to heightened fears about insecurity. As you can imagine, there is now competition for the very scarce resources available in the region. And we see this situation affecting countries like Kenya, where I'm speaking to you from, but also Somalia and Ethiopia. In Somalia, we know that they are seeing a drought, the likes of which they have not seen for 4 decades, 40 years. We've seen thousands of Somalis leave the country, trying to cross the border to Ethiopia to find refuge there, humanitarian assistance and resources. And this is leading obviously to widespread concerns about, if this situation is not urgently addressed, what will be the situation facing these individuals. IOM, the International Organization for Migration, and other UN agencies estimate that at least 15 million, though it could rise to even 20 million people are going to be affected by this ongoing humanitarian crisis. And it's been driven by some of the issues mentioned in your intro there. The lack of the rainfall leading to drought, that obviously has a connection to the climate change situation. And of course, it is creating vast competition for resources amongst some of the world's most vulnerable people here in the Horn of Africa.
And is migration or moving elsewhere even an option for those who want to flee or who can avoid the hunger and save their lives?
Well, we're already seeing vast numbers of people, as I said, moving from Somalia in particular to Ethiopia. Some of those are farmers and they're looking for pasture for their livestock. We've already seen millions of livestock dead because of the drought. And some are taking the dangerous migratory route from the Horn of Africa, that's countries like Somalia, Ethiopia, and Djibouti, to try to cross over to the Gulf nations of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain. Many cross and have been crossing since the onset of this crisis across the Gulf of Aden from the coast of Djibouti, hoping to get to countries like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, like I said, but having to pass through a war zone. So we're seeing vast numbers of people displaced. And the concerning thing for IOM, the International Organization for Migration, is what the impact will be of this forced displacement. We're seeing increased levels of people being the victims of trafficking and smuggling. You can imagine when people are desperate to leave a situation and to escape the drought and the looming famine, they're often the target of people traffickers and smugglers. So there are two migratory options for people. One is to just simply try to cross borders, which we're seeing, which is obviously also leading to higher levels of insecurity as there is that competition, as I say, for resources between the communities who are arriving and the host communities. And then those mainly young people, women, and sometimes children taking the dangerous eastern route from the Horn of Africa to Djibouti, across the Gulf of Aden, to try to reach Gulf countries.
My earlier guest talked about the, war invasion in Ukraine and how it's affecting skyrocketing prices. But then how much of this drought and what's happening at the Horn and East Africa is as a result of climate change and then COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, first on Ukraine, Millicent, we are seeing a connection to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, in the sense that the fuel prices have skyrocketed. And for many of these people, especially farmers and agriculturalists, they rely on cheaper fuel. And we've seen globally the cost of fuel increasing. We've also seen supply chains, global supply chains disrupted. In some of the countries mentioned, Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, they do depend on some imports from Russia and from Ukraine. In terms of climate change, as I said earlier, climate change is one of the root causes of what we're seeing. And what we have seen because of the drought, as I said, Somalia, it is 4 decades, 40 years since they've seen the kind of drought that they're experiencing today. And as a result of that, what the evidence shows us is that much of this drought and changing climatic situations is being caused by increasing climate change. And we're seeing it worsen because, of course, as people move and compete for resources and land, the situation worsens. So there is a clear link between some of the situation that we see going on in Ukraine and in Russia, and of course, what we see happening here in the region vis-a-vis the climatic changes that are forcing many people to uproot their lives, to leave home, to look for greener pastures, literally for livestock, which is leading and fueling a worsening humanitarian situation, which we see manifesting in communal conflict, competition for resources, et cetera, et cetera.
And some would call this a post-COVID-19 era. Is that in any way also impacting this situation?
Well, the COVID-19 pandemic has had different effects in the region. At the onset of the pandemic, of course, with all the borders closed, it was extremely difficult for many people in the region to try to migrate, to try to move. But with the relaxation of border controls and the introduction of a COVID-19 vaccine, we have seen increasing numbers. And of people trying to move. And our concern as IOM, the International Organization for Migration, is that in that desperation to move, the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic has obviously been devastating for millions of people. People are choosing irregular means to move. They're not using formal channels. And as a consequence of that, what we anticipate and what we're concerned about as the IOM is that more people will become the target of traffickers and smugglers and unfortunately die along the way. And we have seen that since the beginning of the pandemic. In 2020, towards the end, and 2021, at least 100 people were killed, mainly young Ethiopians trying to reach the Gulf of Aden to cross over to the Middle East. And we've seen various other examples of women and children being targeted in this way in their attempts to move, simply seeking a better life.
Yvonne, I'm thinking solutions. What can be done to avert this disaster? I mean, there have been calls for more funding. How much is needed now? And will it provide temporary relief or something lasting?
Good question, Millicent. So the UN collectively is appealing for $4.4 billion just to address the looming humanitarian crisis in this region. That is to provide life-saving humanitarian assistance. I'm talking about the basics: food, water, shelter, medical care, psychosocial support and counseling, because as you can imagine, many of these people are traumatized, their lives have been completely disrupted, and they can't see any solution or any end in sight to the situation they're facing. So the appeal that has been issued by the UN agencies, which I say comes to around $4.4 billion, will address some of the urgent needs, emergency response. But ultimately, there is a component and an element of the funding that is being required, which will be targeted towards looking at the drivers and the root causes of the drought and the displacement we are seeing. Obviously, climate change is not an issue that can be tackled alone by individual countries alone. It has to be done collectively. COP27 is coming up towards the end of the year in Cairo, where the UN and other partners hope to have the issues facing people in the Eastern Horn of Africa around drought addressed, but also working with host communities and national governments to try to find sustainable development solutions so that when situations like the one the region is facing now do occur, the instinct of people is not to immediately try to up and leave. And that involves obviously looking at agricultural issues, reduction of imports, et cetera, employment, which is a huge driver, or the lack of employment, which is a huge driver of migration, and trying to address the socioeconomic issues that compel people to up and leave.
Yvonne and Dege, we really hope that things get better. Really hope and pray. Thank you so much. She is the regional spokesperson, East Horn of Africa, UN's migration agency, IOM. Thank you for joining us again. Well, staying in Africa, former Kenyan President Mwai Kibaki, who led the country from 2002 to 2013, has died at the age of 90. As leader, Kibaki, one of the country's richest men, ushered in economic reforms and a new constitution, but failed to deliver on promises to combat corruption. His tenure was also marred by the disputed 2007 pause that led to deadly violence.
Mwai Kibaki, Kenya's third president, who served from 2003 to 2013, was credited with reviving the country's ailing economy through fiscal prudence and infrastructure projects. But his legacy was tarnished by his disputed 2007 re-election. Opposition leader Raila Odinga had been ahead by several 100,000 votes when the Election Commission abruptly stopped announcing the results and ejected journalists. Hours later, the commission announced Kibaki had won by a narrow margin and was hurriedly sworn in.
Why Kibaki?
Most observers say the elections were flawed. Odinga calls for protest, sparking a deadly police crackdown. 1,250 people died in the violence. Former UN Chief Kofi Annan finally brokered a peace deal between Kibaki and Odinga, resulting in a grand coalition government with Odinga as Prime Minister. Kibaki, a former economics lecturer, served as finance minister under Kenya's first two presidents, Jomo Kenyatta and Daniel Arap Moi. Describing him as a quintessential patriot, President Uhuru Kenyatta has ordered a mourning period to honor Kibaki, during which flags will be flown at half-mast.
As a university lecturer, a legislator, member of parliament for 5 decades, a cabinet minister, vice president, official leader of the opposition, and finally, as the third president of the Republic of Kenya, Emilio Mwai Kibaki was a quintessential patriot whose legacy of civic responsibility will continue to inspire generations of Kenyans long into our future.
Kibaki was among Kenya's richest men, overseeing vast land holdings and business interests. When he handed over power to Kenyatta in 2013, Kibaki retreated to his home in one of Nairobi's plushest neighborhoods, close to his beloved Mataiga Golf Club. He's survived by several children and grandchildren.
In Rwanda, the President Paul Kagame says his country is not trading human beings in his first comment on Rwanda's deal with the UK on migrants. Under the deal, asylum seekers arriving in the UK on small boats will be relocated to Rwanda for processing and resettlement. Mr. Kagame, who was on a visit to Congo-Brazzaville, Jamaica and Barbados when the deal was signed, said it would be a mistake to think Rwanda was just getting money for migrants. He said he decided in 2018, when he chaired the African Union, that Rwanda would offer shelter to migrants stuck in Libya or trying to cross to Europe. However, nearly 1,000 migrants have since been taken to Rwanda for processing, with 2/3 of them being relocated to European countries and Canada. Still ahead on the programme. Macron, Le Pen take the offence as both candidates embark on last day of campaign. That's in a moment. An incumbent French President, Emmanuel Macron, and his far-right rival, Marine Le Pen, are both taking the offence ahead of the runoff on their last day of campaign. Speaking on French radio this morning, Mr. Macron has acknowledged his failure to quell some of the anger felt in the country, and which Le Pen, he said, was using to drive her campaign. 2 days before the votes, the centrist pro-European incumbent leads his anti-immigration Eurosceptic challenger in opinion polls by about 10 points. But a likely high level of abstention and anger with some of Macron's policies and his sometimes abrasive style mean his re-election is no done deal. Le Pen, whose policies include a ban on Muslim headscarves in public, giving French nationals priority on jobs and benefits, and limiting Europe's rules on cross-border travel, said Macron embodies an elitism that has failed ordinary people. She told Europe One Radio today that he does not like the French, saying she had the common sense of her mother. She slammed Macron's perceived arrogance in the TV debate, accusing him of disdain towards her and towards voters. And indeed, French far-right presidential candidate Marine Le Pen seeking to woo voters in northern France. This was earlier today. She brought the last leg of her campaign to the French town, tasting a piece of melon, which was also told she petted a chihuahua, and posed for pictures with supporters at an outdoor market. So let's now tell you a bit more about the French elections. Earlier this month, 12 candidates ran for the top job. The first round of the 2022 contest was marked by voter apathy, with participation estimated at 73.3%. This according to analysis by pollster IFOP Fiducial, the lowest in a first round in 20 years. In order to qualify for running, the candidates secure the 500 endorsements from the 42,000 elected French officials needed to enter the race. But ahead of the second round this Sunday, French President Emmanuel Macron will face Marine Le Pen, setting up a rematch of their run of contest in 2017. The 44-year-old incumbent president has in recent weeks focused majority of his time on shuttle diplomacy, with analysts saying Russia's all-out war in Ukraine helped boost his profile. The former investment banker, who became France's youngest president in 2017, has shifted towards the right during his 5-year term. He's promised tax cuts, benefits reform, and a rise in the retirement age. His party, La République En Marche, is pro-European and has managed to attract both traditionally left and right-wing voters. Figures from the last polls put him in first place with 26.8% of the vote. And his challenger, Marine Le Pen, the veteran far-right candidate from the rebranded Reassemblement National Party, formerly the National Front, is in second place at 21.9%. This is Le Pen's third presidential election, and many consider a defeat would put an end to the 53-year-old's political career. She's run a low-key campaign that has seen her tone down her usual hardline rhetoric on immigration in favor of focusing on household income and purchasing power. According to a survey by Ipsos Market Research Group, Le Pen and Macron will have a much smaller margin of difference in the second round of voting, projected at 48.5% versus 51.5%, respectively. Well, I guess Sunday cannot come soon enough, but Europe is watching the second round of the French presidential elections. Deutsche Welle correspondent Chiponda Chimbelu joins me now from Berlin with more. Hi, Chiponda. Just how significant are these elections for Europe?
Well, these elections are really about the future of the EU. We've had 3 European leaders pen a column published in several newspapers calling on French voters to pick the candidate who would maintain European values. Now, by that, they're pretty much saying pick Emmanuel Macron. Now, those leaders are German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, the Spanish President Pedro Sanchez, and the Portuguese Prime Minister Antonio Costa. And they, of course, want to make sure that Macron is really the winner of the election on Sunday, because, of course, they know that Le Pen is a Eurosceptic. She is against the EU, and she wants to reduce the powers of the EU by, taking as much control back to Paris as possible. Now, that would come at a time when the EU needs to be working together. It would destabilize the EU at a time when they need to come up with a solution together to deal with the war in Ukraine. And of course, it's not just about dealing with the war in Ukraine, it's also about rebuilding Ukraine when the war is over. And that is definitely an issue for European leaders, which is why they are watching this election very closely, much like many others across the world, including, of course, the folks in Washington.
And Chip, with all of the progressions, or rather projections on this, what would a win for Le Pen mean for the EU?
Well, in terms of what Le Pen specifically plans, what she plans, of course, is withholding some of the payments that France makes to the EU. Now, France is the EU's second biggest contributor in terms of the budget, because it's, of course, the second biggest economy in the EU. So that would be a major deal. She also wants to reduce or get rid of subsidies for renewable energy. That would be something that would be definitely an issue in terms of the EU meeting its climate change goals. And then, of course, she also wants to remove France from basically the French military from the NATO military command. Now, this is something that is, of course, a huge concern for the EU because, of course, several countries in the EU are also members of NATO. But, of course, on top of that, she also wants to prioritize French citizens over EU nationals when it comes to essentially social welfare, housing, and jobs. Now, this is something that goes against EU principles because, of course, EU citizens should be treated equally when they move across the bloc. She also wants to introduce border controls in terms of goods moving over from other European countries. Now, this is something that is ridiculous because, of course, she wants to get them checked in terms of those products meeting French standards, but EU standards are French standards, but of course, that is definitely something that would be against the principles of the EU. So there's a lot she's planning, reducing pretty much the EU's influence in France and basically taking France out of integration of the European integration project. And of course, it's taking it back in terms of its global role. So that is something that, of course, is a major concern.
So what do you think? Who has a better chance of emerging as the winner?
So a lot of the polls that we're seeing are giving Emmanuel Macron the clear advantage. A lot of the polls have given him a 10 to 15% percentage point lead over Le Pen. Now, that said, there's still a big but because, of course, 30% of French voters are undecided. And we also know that 22% of the voters in the first round picked the far left candidate. Now, that means that the centrist candidate, Macron, and the far right candidate, Le Pen, are pretty much competing for voters who would normally not vote for either of them in an election. Now, this is what makes the situation very complicated because, of course, a lot of those voters may very well decide not to vote. And if that happens to be the case, that would reduce in terms the margin in between the winner and the loser of this vote on Sunday. So this is something that, of course, a lot of people watching this election and people who even care about the future of Europe will be watching very closely on Sunday.
Thanks very much. Deutsche Welle correspondent Chiponda Chimbelu there joining us from Berlin. And the US Supreme Court has ruled in favor of a Jewish family trying to retrieve a Camille Pissarro painting seized by the Nazis in 1939 and now owned by a leading Spanish museum in the latest twist of their long-running litigation that remains open. Bernardo Cremade is lawyer of the Jewish Community of Madrid and the Federation of Jewish Communities of Spain that are helping the Casiera family, told reporters a day after the ruling that the family believes this is a success and they are hopeful that justice will be served. The heirs of Lili Casiera, whose family owned an art gallery and publishing house, have been locked in a court battle spanning almost 2 decades with Madrid's Thyssen-born Misa Collection Foundation over the 1897 Paris street scene. The US Supreme Court had been asked to decide which jurisdictions' laws cover the dispute, and it unanimously said it should be the state of California's law rather than federal law and returned the case to lower courts, according to court's document. Casiera's heirs had appealed the previous ruling by a California court, which said that under federal law, the Madrid Museum was the rightful owner. The Thyssen Museum, however, said in a statement it was confident that the appeals court in California would rule in its favor.
The family believe that this is a success, and they are hopeful that justice will be served. We cannot anticipate what the courts will say. We believe that with the law at hand, California substantive law should apply, and therefore the painting be returned to the family. However, that is something that the courts are yet to decide, and we will see what the outcome will be.
Finally, on the program, over in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sister Sisa spends most of her day manning the micro-hydroelectric plant she built to overcome daily electricity cuts in her town of Miti, the east of the country. Blackouts are a daily disruption in the Congo, a vast Central African country of around 90 million people that sources most of its electricity from a run-down and mismanaged hydropower system.
Clad in her white veil, tucked under a builder's hat, she spends most of her day manning a micro-hydroelectric plant she built to overcome daily electricity cuts in her town of Miti in Democratic Republic of Congo.
The convent needed an electrician, a technician who could help. They saw in me the talent of electrical engineering, so they offered me an opportunity to go study electrical engineering. That's where it all started. It was the convent that made me study. I studied at ITFM, and when I finished, I started this service.
Blackouts are a daily disruption across the country, which sources most of its electricity from a rundown and mismanaged hydropower system. Despite millions of dollars in donor funding, the World Bank estimates that only around 20% of the population has access to electricity. Fed up with relying on candlelight and costly fuel power generators, Caesar started raising money in 2015 to build the hydropower plant.
With the current we produce for the school, we believe that we are training young people, and with the current that we give to the hospital, we feel that we serve the whole population because we are there for the poor, and it is in the hospital that we meet people from poor backgrounds.
Thanks to our efforts, students at Miti Secondary School can now learn computer skills from screens instead of books.
This electricity is very important because it helps children a lot. It also helps the school. Before we had electricity, we had computers, but the computer courses were always theoretical, and it was a lot of pain. So this has helped a lot.
Without the plant, residents in Miti would only have electricity 2 or 3 days a week for a few hours.
Amazing. And that's it on The World Today. Thank you for watching. I'm Millicent Walker. Have a great weekend.